So, Sakari Oramo, welcome and thank you for meeting me here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
You will be in Switzerland very soon with the symphonies by Jean Sibelius. What brought you to the idea of playing seven symphonies in just 3 days?
Actually, this project was supposed to probably happen already a couple of years ago, but for reasons that we all know, it was postponed. And so it's a fairly long time ago since this was originally planned. Then at some point, there was also the idea of bringing in the violin concerto as well. But then the decision was made that it would just be purely the seven numbered symphonies by Sibelius. And of course, for a Finnish conductor, working with a top class international British orchestra, it's a great thing to be able to do, because we have done a Sibelius cycle with the BBC Symphony before, but this was spread out over a season in London. So doing all seven in one go like that, it's only my second time in my whole career. The first one was with the Finnish Radio Symphony Orchestra maybe about 15 years ago in the Bergen Festival in Norway. And so it'll be really exciting to embark on this journey again.
So there's always this point with pieces or any type of music of starting an interpretation, right? Of starting to dive into a new work. As a conductor, what was important for you for the approach of the music of Sibelius?
Well, I have, of course, been immersed in Sibelius's music since I was a child, and maybe even before that. Who knows? I've played in orchestras. I'm a violinist originally, and I've played in orchestras under conductors like Paavo Berglund, Jukka-Pekka Saraste, Esa-Pekka Salonen, all conducting Sibelius and other things, of course, as well. And so I have a very, very long process with this music. And I have to also say that since I did my CD recorded set with the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, now over 20 years ago, my approach to the music both has changed and hasn't changed from that. What I've tried to do is I've always tried to go back to the source, because Sibelius is a composer that there's a myth about him that he was not able to orchestrate like he would have wanted to hear the music. And this myth has been sort of hovering around with many conductors who've printed kind of their own mark to Sibelius's music. And the result of my analysis is that the music actually works perfectly fine without any changes, because there's been a lot of retouche made in the past, a lot of small but significant changes in laying out the chords, dynamics, articulations, etc. And I've just wanted to kind of embrace what Sibelius actually wrote. And this sounds kind of simple, but it's actually very complex, because his writing is in such a way inspired that he didn't always go logically. But to try to understand the source of his inspiration, which without any exceptions was emotion and nature, is for me very important. So I want to feel the complete emotional trajectory of each work, and also of the seven symphonies altogether. One other important point is that Sibelius lived a very long life, but of course he didn't know it when he was living. He lived to be 92, but actually these symphonies are written in fairly short time span of 25 years of his life. So 1899, First Symphony, up until 1924, Seventh Symphony. So they don't represent the whole variety of Sibelius's development and music. They only represent the kind of core of it, or the essential part. But I think there's still a lot that has happened already before the First Symphony. And there is certainly a lot that will happen after the Seventh Symphony, but that will never come out in music. We know that he has written an Eighth Symphony, or at least parts of it, and destroyed it in a fire. And so on. So I mean, it's a story that kind of ends but still continues.
Does it take some kind of courage when you said you were going back to this playing, interpreting the music as it was actually written without applying any changes? Is there some kind of pressure in the world of performance that you should actually perhaps not do that, like go with those changes because they are supposedly better? Does it take some kind of courage to do that, or how do you feel about that?
It absolutely does, yes. And conducting Sibelius is not for the faint-hearted anyway. You need courage to embrace, because every piece is kind of different, but also contains the seeds to what comes after it. So you can feel in the Third Symphony the sort of friction that is then going to happen in the Fourth Symphony. You can feel the incredible movement from concrete to abstract in the Fifth Symphony that then happens completely in the Sixth Symphony, and even more in the Seventh. So to kind of pull all this together and to make it to a musically rewarding performance requires a lot of attitude. It doesn't require for the conductor or the musicians to be finished. I don't think that has any point in the music, or indeed the listeners. This is universal music in the great symphonic tradition. And as Sibelius said, in the days of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, my colleagues offer cocktails and very spiked drinks, and I offer my audience pure spring water. This is quite interesting, and this was the direction that he went to gradually in his symphonies. The purer the better, but without losing any of the emotional impact.
Sibelius was Finnish. You talked briefly about growing up with his music as you grew up in Finland, and you also briefly talked about this emotional journey. This all points a little bit to this term of Nordic music, Nordic style of classical music. Maybe for somebody who is not so familiar with the term, how would you describe this Nordic genre of classical music?
Yes, of course, it contains many different kinds of ways to compose, but especially in those years, sort of starting when Sibelius was born, 1865, and also the great Danish composer Carl Nielsen was born the same year, as it happens. The two had very, very little in common. They were like from totally different worlds. Sibelius was from Finland, that was at the time a part of Russia and fairly poor country economically, but he belonged to the sort of middle to upper classes because his parents were sort of quite well off, relatively speaking. Nielsen came from the countryside. He was a farmer's son. And I think you can hear this in his music, both in the sort of countryside style, but also in the slightly anarchistic attitude that Nielsen had, that Sibelius never had. Sibelius was always a subject of a sort of functioning entity, be it the Russian Empire or the then, from 1918 onwards, independent Finnish state. And he came from a background where kind of the ideals were, making music together at home and also creating this kind of musical identity to the Finnish nation that hadn't really existed before in the classical sense. Then there are other important Nordic names. Edouard Grieg, of course, the great Norwegian composer, a little bit older than than Nielsen and Sibelius, 20 years older about. And of course, very well loved in the Central European music culture. And also, I think, better known probably, especially for his more popular pieces like Peer Gynt piano concerto, for instance. And there were a couple of others also, like Wilhelm Stenhammar, Swedish composer. He was the sort of connecting factor between all these Nordic composers that really wanted nothing to do with each other. He invited them all to Göteborg, where he was based, and held a big festival of Nordic music, where, for instance, Sibelius and Nielsen would meet, but they wouldn't really have anything to say to each other. They were so completely different. So I mean, describing Nordic music of the, say, late Romantic period is almost as complex as describing, let's say, Western European music, including France, Germany, Britain, Spain, etc. So Italy. So it's quite a rich and varied landscape. Of course, it's not quite as big as this Western European area, but and there's also always the influence of the East, Russian music, influenced Sibelius quite a lot, especially early on in his composing. Then less and less, he grew like further away from it. But whether that had any impact on Nielsen, I don't think so. Nielsen was influenced more like by his kind of background and his very strong imagination. Grieg was very influenced by the German Romantics. He studied in Leipzig. He was kind of very much in the sort of Central European character of composing. And I think Sibelius, in a way, combined these elements a little bit. So he also wanted to be popular in Germany. He wanted to study in Germany. He had German friends. His publisher was German, Peikoff and Hertel. His whole ethos was to be a part of the great European symphonic tradition. And the fact that it didn't quite work out like that, Sibelius is more popular today in the United Kingdom and in the United States than he is in Germany or France. And there have been attempts, and there are sort of great advocates of Sibelius's music. Take Herbert von Karajan, Sir Simon Rattle, and many others, of course, also. And they've all kind of made the point that this is great music, this is universal music. And it takes a long time to kind of come from the fringes of the European geography to the middle.
With you bringing those 7 symphonies to Switzerland, it's still poses some there's a little bit of an unusual element with it, and in a totally positive way. And it shows, I would argue, a great deal of passion for that music from your side also. What would you say is, in our time, maybe the relevance of Sibelius's music and perhaps even his personality?
Yes, it's a very good question. And I think to sort of to see Sibelius's relevance today is to understand that with the smallest of means and the smallest amount of small motives, you can develop works of art that are huge in emotional and physical and content sense also. So he worked with sort of pieces of material, he said, it is as if God would throw pieces of a mosaic down on earth, and my task is to put them together and make them sort of senseful, purposeful entities. And for the for the listener that is not used to listening to Sibelius's music, every piece is different. And of course, we are doing the symphonies in 3 different cities, so it's maybe unlikely that the same people will hear all of them. But they was always get a snippet of this kind of overarching development. The first symphony has this kind of incredible melodic character. It's got great tunes, quite simply, and it is also very, very jubilant in a way as a piece. The second symphony is somewhere between moving towards a sort of more structured way of composing. First symphony is a bit like a fantasy in a way. Second symphony is already a kind of dense form, and it has, as all of these pieces actually, it has a sort of very strong dualism of great joy and also melancholy in it. This has to do with the two separate things, that the second symphony was actually composed in Italy. Sibelius' family wanted to get out from Finland after their daughter had died very young. One of their daughters. They had 5 who survived, and they spent a winter in Italy in Rapallo, which is near Genova on the sort of Ligurian coast, and the weather was terrible. It was horrible. It was a horrible winter in that part of the world. And Jean decided to leave the family there and go to Rome to have some fun. So, I mean, this is the background, and he kind of, there is this exhilaration, but also this kind of deep melancholy over the loss, and so on. So it's every piece has a kind of strong meaning. The third symphony starts in a sort of folk-like. So it's a new thing again to have this kind of folk music element, which, however, never quotes any Finnish or other folk music. It's just the style is there. And the third symphony I associate with the sort of early Christian period. So period after paganism, when we have just adopted a new faith. And it has to be said here that Sibelius was not religious as a person, especially for his time. He was actually quite unreligious. But in the third symphony, he kind of adopted this idea of purity and joy through a new idea that has emerged. And it's all kind of seen and heard in the music.
So there's this very almost human aspect, no, in the entirety of the 7 symphonies, that each has their own little aspect of life almost, no, or aspect of...
Absolutely, yes. And I also would pull the attention to the fact that Sibelius and nature are often talked about together simultaneously. And of course, Sibelius, no doubt, he was interested in nature. He had the Finnish landscape in his mind. And there I would like to think about what is common between the landscape of Switzerland and the landscape of Finland. Finland is very flat. It only has tiny mountains because they're so old. They're much older than your Alps. And therefore they have been kind of eroded down. But there is a lot of energy in the terrain that kind of transcribes not as high mountains, but as a lot of power of growth in the summer, quick and intense. And then the winter, I think if I look out of my window here in Finland today, I see a lot of snow. This is a landscape that could almost be somewhere in Switzerland on a slightly flatter area maybe. But this intense kind of wintry freshness that is existent. And I think this also is something that can be heard in Sibelius' music. And I think that could be a way for Swiss audiences to also connect to Sibelius' music. The snow, but also the intensity of the growing period after the winter. And in fact, talking about the 6th symphony, sometimes someone has said that it sounds like melting snow.
That's a beautiful image. Beautiful
Yes.
image, yeah. Just about perhaps conducting on a more broader perspective, you, as we now know, of course, you were born in Finland, you grew up in Finland, and not only that, you are one of the many really outstanding conductors from Finland. You are joined by many, and some people pointed out that maybe for the past 25, 30 years, there was really a tradition of really great Finnish conducting. So now that I have you here, why is that? What's the secret of Finnish conducting? Why are there so many great Finnish conductors?
Yeah, it's a question that I'm asked quite often, and I'm sure my colleagues too. It's a complex question, but I think there are several aspects. First of all, my generation and also the generation before me, Jukka-Pekka Saraste, Esa-Pekka Salonen, for instance, they had and we had great role models. So conductors who came from Finland, who became internationally recognized, Paavo Berglund, Leif Segerstam, and so on and so forth, Okko Kamu. And this chain of role models has continued. So my role models were the generation before me, and I have been a role model to people who've come after me. And I've also been sort of lucky enough to be able to teach a couple of people that are now already in the international scene, and have followed suit. And that's one thing, the sort of fact that we have role models. It's a bit like the Finnish rally drivers as well. I mean, they've been very famous, and there's always been the next generation who just drives faster than anyone else. And I think it's pointless, but maybe it can be sort of seen as a slight parallel there. And the other thing is education. Finnish music education was dramatically improved in the 1970s, quite consciously by the government, and a sort of system was created that actually happened. I don't know if it was the purpose, but it happened to become a system which kind of created a really good breeding ground for conducting, because it allowed people to study in an individual fashion. It was quite modern at the time. You were not put into these sort of strict exam patterns and so on, but we were able to kind of find our own ways with music and perform a lot and just even badly sometimes, but no one cared. It was just important to do, to perform, to rehearse, to practice, to read music, and then suddenly, boom, you're there. And oops, my second recording device fell down. Yeah, this is better. And it was just like this fertile ground happened to be there. Whether it's still there, I'm not so sure. I'm a bit worried about it at the moment, but this is another question. And of course, now we see that there are people like Klaus Mäkelä, who is now future chief conductor of the Concertgebouw, and he's still not 30 years old. And he's Orchestre de Paris, and he's everywhere. And it's just an incredible thing to see that happen. But it's happened all over again. And Tarmo Peltokoski, the new chief conductor in Toulouse, coming up at the Capitol, and various others. So, I mean, this is kind of, it seems to be a pattern that keeps coming. And quite frankly, I didn't expect it to continue so intensely. Let's say 10 years ago. I thought, oh, this is going to dry up, but it didn't actually. It hasn't so far. Whether Finnish conductors are all similar is probably a different question. I think we are quite different from each other. And this is because we are allowed to be our own personalities. But there's something in common, maybe this kind of respect towards orchestras is one big thing. That certainly Jorma Panula, who taught most of us at some point, placed a great emphasis on how to treat an orchestra, how to speak to an orchestra, how to rehearse an orchestra. And the other thing is the quest for technical clarity, which then helps to kind of free up the emotion of the music, rather than trying to be emotionally very present and lose the technical clarity, because then you don't win the orchestra to your side.
Yeah, there are many aspects of it, but I think this keeping or allowing space for the individual personality is a thing that tends to get lost sometimes during musical training.
Yeah, I think it's true, and I'm certainly very aware of trying to sort of, because I teach as well. I'm professor now in Helsinki of conducting, and I try to sort of keep my students looking like themselves, not like each other, but like themselves.
Well, it speaks to you that this next generation of Finnish conductors, you were in this role of being the role model that time. No,
Yeah, one of them. Yes, there are several, but yeah, it's quite sort of responsible position to be in.
Sakari, last question before I let you go. As a musician, as a conductor, you every once in a while you are on tour. You tour a lot, and is there anything you always bring with you when you go on tour, when you go on your travels?
Toothbrush. But more seriously speaking, I actually tried to reduce my luggage to a minimum recently. So I'm trying to bring less and less things. But one thing I will always bring is my pillow, because I like a certain kind of pillow, and usually don't find it in hotels or various places where I stay. So there has to be space for the pillow.
Right, that's a really smart thing to bring, I would think.
Yeah, it just helps, because if the well-being isn't there when you sleep, then it can't be there when you perform either.
Of course. Beautiful. So, Sakari, thank you so much again for your time, and I really look forward to meeting you very soon.
Thank you, Edouard. Yes, looking forward to. Thank you.